We're studying Foundation Truth, and if you do not have a copy of the book, I would encourage you to obtain one from the Living Faith office. This book has been translated into 30 languages, used in 80 nations around the world. It's an excellent study tool. It will help you as we study these lessons. This is lesson number 8. The subject is stewardship. Stewardship. It's a very vital, important lesson because it deals with not just the part of tithing and offering, but it deals with our entire life, our philosophy of money, how we look at money. Our memory text comes from the book of 1 Corinthians, the 4th chapter and verse 2, where he says, "Moreover, it is required in stewards that one be found faithful." 1 Corinthians 4 and 2. That this shows us, as stewards of God, we are going to give an account to the boss, to the Creator, to God Himself. See, stewardship is the practice of a systematic and proportion, that giving of time, abilities, and material possessions based on these are a conviction from God. They're a trust that God has given to us. That's what stewardship is all about. So we're not just talking about money. We're not just talking about wealth here. We're talking about our entire life, our time, our talents, everything which God has given to us, that we learn to steward that properly, knowing that we're going to give an account to God. See, we're not the owner. This shows the contrast here between ownership and stewardship. God is the owner. We are His stewards. And we will give an account for our lives. Ownership. There's some good verses of Scripture concerning that. In the book of Genesis, the 14th chapter, verse 19, verse 22. The book of Psalms 24 and verse 1. Psalm 50, verses 1 through 12. Psalm 89, verse 11. And the book of Haggai, the 2nd chapter and verse 8, talks about ownership. God is the owner. He owns everything. It all belongs to Him because He is the Creator. Now, what is ownership? Ownership is the possession of the right to control. God is the only one that has that right. You and I are not the owners. So point B, stewardship. Good scriptures for this is Matthew, the 25th chapter, verses 14 through 30, and also the book of Luke, the 19th chapter, verses 11 through 26. We will give an account to God. He is the owner. We are simply His stewards. We are not owners, but we are responsible and accountable to God. So what is stewardship? Stewardship is managing the property of another. It doesn't belong to us. It belongs to God. See, let me give you a graph here that will help you to understand this. God is the giver. Mankind, we are the receiver. We created nothing. God is the one that creates it. With God, He is the possessor. Mankind is the steward of that. We are not the one that possesses. We are stewards of God's property. God is the owner, the owners. Mankind, we are responsible, accountable. We are able to use, abuse, and lose. That is our position as mankind. Another difference is God is the rewarder and mankind is the rewarded. So God is the one that owns it all. You and I are simply stewards. Now let's talk about some owner-steward relationships here. Give you some biblical examples that I think will help us to understand this subject. Point A, life. Life is a gift from God. God gave it to us. We didn't create it. We didn't earn it. We didn't deserve it. It's what we receive from God. You find that in Genesis, the 1st chapter, verse 27 and 28. The book of Acts, the 17th chapter, verse 25. And the book of James, the 1st chapter and verse 17. Another thing that God has given to us that we must learn to steward is time. Time. Time is what we are allotted. The amount of time that we have to live our lives. You find this in Proverbs, the 24th chapter, verses 30 through 34. Also in the book of Psalms 90 and verse 12. That particular verse, he talks about how that we need to apply our hearts to wisdom and number our days. We tend to just count years, but he said, count your days that God has given to you. So he's talking about time in our life. Then point C, God has given us talents, abilities. Each one of us has unique gifts that God has given to us, abilities. All of us are uniquely different concerning this. Matthew, the 25th chapter, verses 14 through 30 is a good illustration of this. So he gives to us these gifts that we are to properly steward. Another one that God has given to us, point D, is possessions. Possessions. That are the things, what has been entrusted to us. You find that in Matthew, the 6th chapter, verses 19 through 21, and also Colossians, the 3rd chapter, verses 1 and 2. So possessions are a gift from God. One of those possessions, and this is point E, is finances or money. That's what we usually think about when we think about being stewards, but that's only one part of stewardship. This is what we earn as we labor, as we work. 1 Corinthians, the 16th chapter, verses 1 and 2, where he talks about how that we need to steward the money that we have received from our wages. And we need to steward it by giving God honor, putting God first in our finances. So let me talk about some of the requirements of being a good steward. If we're going to be a good steward, point A, we must be faithful. Faithful. That goes back to our memory text in 1 Corinthians 4, verses 1 and 2. Moreover, it's required of a steward that one be found faithful. It means being dependable, someone that can be trusted. Trusted with what you have given to them. And so if we're going to be a good steward, we must be faithful. Point B, we must be teachable. Teachable. In other words, are we open to instruction? Are we willing to continue to learn? You'll find that in Psalm 27 and verse 11. Be teachable. Point C, the desire to minister. In other words, with what God has given to us, we must have the motivation to serve others, to help others. You'll find that in Romans, the 12th chapter, verses 10 through 13. And so we've got to have the motivation to serve. To be a good steward, we must have, point D, a servant's heart. A servant's heart. In other words, we are not trying to be the boss. No, we recognize God is the boss. He's the owner. We are all going to be accountable to him. Galatians, the 5th chapter and verse 13, we are to serve one another. And then point E, have a willingness to give. A willingness to give. That simply means we develop a generous spirit. God has not given us a spirit of stinginess. No, that is not the will of God for us to be stingy. In Luke, the 6th chapter and verse 38, freely you receive, you should freely give. So let me ask a question here. The question is, are stewards accountable? Now we know the answer to that is obviously yes. But here is a good story to help us to understand it. The book of Luke, the 16th chapter, verse 1 and 2, you read, and he said to his disciples, there was a certain rich man who had a steward, and an accusation was brought to him that the man was wasting his goods. So he called him, and he said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward. Then the steward said within himself, what shall I do? For my master is taking the stewardship away from me. I cannot dig. In other words, I'm not physically able to do that. I'm ashamed to beg. I am resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. So he called every one of his master's debtors to him, and he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. So he said to him, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said, take your bill and write 80. So his master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. Notice the words of Jesus, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. And I say to you, make friends for yourself by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. He who is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much. He who is unjust in that which is least is unjust also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust true riches? And if you've not been faithful in that which is another man's, who will give you what is your own? No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Wow, what a story. What a story. It gives a lot of people problems, but this is a story that Jesus told to make us think about stewardship. So the question, are stewards accountable for their stewardship? Absolutely, yes. We are all going to give an account to God for our stewardship. Another question, is it possible for us to forfeit our stewardship? Yes. This story makes it very clear that we can forfeit our stewardship. Now, going back and trying to help you understand this story, let me give you some points that I've learned. Point A, the steward was managing his master's property. It didn't belong to him. It belonged to the rich man, to his master. And he was simply taking care of his master's goods. Point B, the steward was unjustly accused. Now that's a key phrase there. Unjustly accused of being wasteful. Now, no doubt, as we see in the story, he has a lot of goods that he has distributed, but he has not collected for his master as yet. And that's why, no doubt, the accusation arose. But he disproves that with a very smart move. So I believe it's very clear the steward was unjustly accused of being wasteful. Point C, the master asked the steward to give an account of his actions. And sooner or later, all of us are going to be held accountable before God. We will answer before God what we did with the things that God has given to us. Point D, the steward almost lost his job over these accusations. In other words, he held him accountable and said, turn in the books and give a report for what you've done. He almost lost it because we find the master commending him for his decision in the end. And he would not have commended him if he had not done something very wise here. Point E, the steward comes up with a decision, an idea of how that he can prove his honesty, that he has not wasted his master's goods, and at the same time collect the money that is owed his master. The way that he does this is by giving a discount. It's a common practice in business all over the world, what we call a cash discount. If you'll pay cash, I will discount the bill. And that's what he did. How much do you owe? And he said, oh, I owe this. And he said, okay, I will discount it if you'll pay now. That's what he's doing. He's collecting. He didn't have to collect it. He had been told he was fired. He could have walked away, but he was wiser than that. So by discounting the bills, he was able to collect, and he proved he was not wasting his master's goods. So point F, the master commends him. And this is a verse that this troubled me for a long time. I was wondering, if he's an unjust steward, why is he commending him? Well, he was unjustly called an unjust steward because he proves that was false. It was not false. It was a false accusation against him and was a very wise move on his behalf, because he not only collected the money that was owed, he also proved he was a good steward. Now, point G, I learned from this story, unrighteous mammon. What's Jesus talking about when he talks about unrighteous mammon? He's simply talking about money. Money. He contrasts money with what he calls true riches. Now, what are true riches? True riches are things that money cannot buy. In fact, the most important things in life, money cannot buy them. Money, for instance, cannot buy you health. It can buy you medicine, but it cannot buy you health. And it's always that way. The most important things, the true riches, are things that money cannot buy. The next thing, point H, is I learned faithfulness is the key word here. It's repeated actually 4 times in these verses. 4 times. He talks about faithfulness. That's what God is going to look for in our lives. God expects us as his stewards to be faithful. Moreover, it is required of a steward that one be found faithful. That's the key word that God is looking for. Point I, we can make friends for ourselves by the wise use of money. Unrighteous mammon, Jesus called it. By wisely invested our money in helping people. Now, I know there are people, I don't buy my friends. I remember I was talking to my daughter about this one day, and she said, I don't buy my friends. I said, I understand. I do. Boy, she really got upset then. I said, now wait just a minute, calm down, listen to me. Every time your friends come over to the house, they're always hungry. Who do you think is buying the pizza? Dad's buying the pizza. Now, I'm happy to do it because I'm happy your friends are here and they're having a wonderful time. I know where you are. I know everything is okay. And so I'm happy to do it. But I have to invest in them, because if I don't feed them, they will go somewhere else. That's what Jesus is simply saying. He's saying that if we will learn how to invest in others, that's a wise use of our money. By using our money to invest in others, we're building relationships with other people. I love this verse of scripture from Proverbs 15 and 16, where he says, better is little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure with trouble. Boy, that's, if you learn how to wisely invest your money, invest in people, and by doing so, there's going to be great reward for this. And so this explains this story, why that this man was counted wise by his master that had been falsely accused. See, it's our attitude toward money, that reveals our heart, You can tell what a man is thinking about by listening to the words that he says. You can tell what is important to a man by the way that he gives. Jesus said this, Matthew 16 and 21, for where your treasure is, your heart will be also. If you're not willing to invest in it, it's because it doesn't mean anything to you. Things that have value to us, we are ready to invest in them. So let me ask a good question here. How can I transfer my ownership to God? How can I become a good steward that's being faithful with what God has entrusted me? Here are some of the ways that we can do it. Number one, I will base every decision on how my money will be earned or used on biblical principles, scriptural principles. That's the best place to start. Start with the Bible. What does the Bible say about this? See, there's some things I don't need to be involved in. There's some money that comes with a curse. There's some money that comes with problems. You don't want to get involved in that. And so every decision that I make concerning stewardship and using my money, every decision should be based upon scriptural principles. And if I do, I'm already way ahead in the game because I am wisely putting God in his proper place in my life. We'll talk about tithing later, but tithing is putting God first, showing with my finances, God is number one in my life. Point number two, I begin to view myself as a steward rather than an owner. That I recognize I own nothing. Everything I have, I owe it to God. Even my own soul. He purchased my soul by dying for my sins. He paid my debt for me. Everything, my life, it's a gift from God. Everything that I have, I'm a steward, not an owner. I don't have the right to control it. He has the right of control because he is the owner. He's the creator. And by right of creation, he has a right to tell me what I need to do with my life. And so I changed my attitude. I began to view myself as a steward, not an owner. Number three, God has every right to take or leave my possessions as he sees fit. Now, that's where a lot of people, they get in trouble because they don't want to give up the ownership. They don't want to give up the control of that. They want to say, it's mine. And God will test us with this. God will test us to see if our hands are open or if they are closed. And I've seen what happens in so many people's lives. The moment that God gives them something, they close their hand. They hold on to it. But we must learn like Job of old. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Don't close your hand. Don't become tight-fisted with God. Leave your hand open. Hold things loosely. That way you don't fight and struggle with it. God has the right to take it or to leave it. I have the right to surrender to him and to worship him knowing he's wiser than I am. His ways are better than my ways. Now, point number four I see. By giving God the ownership of my money, I allow him to work supernaturally through it. Now, a lot of people want God to do miracles with their money. Oh, yes, they want God to bless them and multiply them, but they're not willing to surrender the ownership to him. They're not willing to yield it to God. They keep trying to control it and trying to get God to bless what they're doing rather than looking around, seeing what God is doing and becoming involved in God's work. I encourage you, learn this principle of stewardship. And by giving it all to God, turning it over to him, God works miracles for us. God does supernatural things for us. But God cannot give some people anything because they've got too tight a grip on what they already have. They're holding on so tightly that God cannot bless them with any more. I encourage you, release it. Give it to God. And by giving it to God, You not only are going to experience God taking something away, God will give you more in return. And I assure you, friend, God's shovel is bigger than yours. God is greater than you are. So surrender it to Him. Here's point number 5. I learned God will require me to obey His commands once I transfer ownership of my money to Him. It doesn't belong to me anymore. Now, this is something that I learned many, many years ago in what we call living by faith. I learned that I must trust God with everything, and that if I will do that, then I can be assured God is going to take care of every need in my life. So I transfer the ownership to Him, and God takes care of His child, of His son, His servant. Number 6, I learned one day I must give an account to God of how I have managed all the funds that God has entrusted to me. I'm going to stand before Him, and I'm going to give an account for my life. Point number 7, I learned God usually asks first for the objects of my cherished affection. Not allow anything become a heart idol, something that I worship. He asks of that so that I am free of idolatry. Point number 8, giving God the rightful ownership of my possessions means that I die emotionally to them. Point number 9, the actions of Abraham in the scripture provide an excellent example for us of how to transfer ownership of our possessions to God. And then 10, I purpose this date I will serve the Lord more than I will serve money. And so I close by asking you this question. Do you own your possessions, or do they own you? God help us to become good stewards.